When a Mississippi girl turns 13, she's allowed to stay home alone briefly for the first time. This simple rite of passage turns nightmarish when her mother returns home to find an empty house and signs of a struggle in this episode of Last Seen Alive. Thanks for listening to Last Seen Alive. I'm your host, Leah, crime analyst by day and true crime storyteller by night.
And as always, I'm your co-host, Scott.
The recent advent of Hurricane Ian got me thinking about this case. A case where an innocent young woman disappeared beneath stormy skies as a powerful hurricane swept over the coast of her home state. And while the extreme weather event may set the background for this case, make no mistake, what happened to Leigh Occhi was no act of nature. The cause of her disappearance was very human and undoubtedly criminal. Leigh Occhi was last seen alive on August 27, 1992. Leigh was 13 years old and lived with her mom in Tupelo, Mississippi, a town of about 38,000 people located in the northeastern part of the state. Although Tupelo is closer to its neighboring states of Tennessee and Alabama than it is to Mississippi's own coast, on the day of Leigh's disappearance, the weather was expected to be stormy thanks to Hurricane Andrew, which had recently struck Florida and Louisiana as a tremendously powerful Category 5 hurricane and was sweeping westward toward Mississippi. Although Tupelo wasn't a coastal town, it was expecting rain and wind as a result of the storm, and it was on this dark and stormy day that 13-year-old Leigh would be allowed to stay home all by herself for the very first time.
Spooky.
Right? The school year hadn't quite started yet, and her mom, Vicky, had work, so after breakfast, Leigh would have the house to herself, at least for a little while. The plan was for her grandmother to pick her up from the house that morning, approximately an hour after her mom left for work. Together, Leigh and her grandmother would attend an open house at Leigh's school, where she'd be starting the 8th grade in just a few days. So really, Leigh would only be home by herself for an hour, but still, this little taste of independence was a brand new privilege for her.
It really is one of those great milestones for every kid.
Right? You feel so cool when you're finally allowed to stay home, even if it's just a real short trip like it was when I was a kid. I remember my parents might go down the street to the nearest grocery store and that was it, but I still felt so cool staying home.
First taste of responsibility. It only goes downhill from there.
All you had to do was not burn the house down and everything would be fine. Leigh's mom, Vicky, ate breakfast with Leigh and left for work just before 8 a.m. By that time, a hurricane alert had been declared over the coast of Mississippi, and rain was already pelting down miles north over Tupelo. Vicky worked at the office of a mattress and furniture company, and no sooner had she settled into her office that morning than she began to worry. Maybe the day of a hurricane wasn't the best time to leave her daughter home alone for the first time. Even if they wouldn't experience the worst of the storm in Tupelo, the heavy rain and accompanying wind were unsettling.
As a parent, I wouldn't want to leave our kids home alone on a hurricane day.
Yeah, but I could kind of see, you plan this in advance. Maybe the kid knows for days they're going to finally be allowed to stay home alone for just 1 hour. That's probably before you have the warning about the weather, and then the weather arrives and you start to second guess yourself. Anyway, Vicky picked up the phone and called home, expecting Leigh to answer. When she didn't, Vicky's anxiety ballooned and she called her mother, Leigh's grandmother, and asked her to swing by the house early to check on Leigh. However, this didn't do much to alleviate Vicky's anxiety. Within moments, despite having made that phone call, she grabbed her things that she'd just put down and headed back out through the rain to her car. She was going home to check on her one and only child, Leigh. Their home was only 1.5 miles away from Vicky's workplace, so she was back at the house in almost no time at all. And when she arrived back at the single-story brick home she shared with her daughter, she immediately noticed something strange. The garage door was open. And by garage door, I don't mean an ordinary pedestrian door, but rather one of the large doors that rolls up to allow a vehicle to exit or enter a garage. Not only that, but a light was on. Leigh, who of course wasn't old enough to drive, would have had no reason to open the garage door or to go into the garage at all, especially so early in the morning in the middle of a storm.
I assume they just had one car.
As far as I know, yes. Already on edge, Vicky entered the house where she discovered something far more alarming. Blood spatter on the wall. Not only that, but a pool of blood on the floor outside of Leigh's bedroom. Inside the bedroom, Leigh's favorite blanket lay abandoned, crumpled on the floor. Vicky scrambled around the house, checking its rooms, the backyard, the swimming pool, and even the shed for any sign of Leigh. All these places were empty. Vicky called 911 and police responded immediately to the home. When they arrived, they saw the pool of blood that had panicked Vicky and noted that it hadn't yet dried. They also noticed blood spatter above it on the door frame. According to an article by William Moore for the Daily Journal, the blood spatter was at a height consistent with someone of Leigh's height having experienced head trauma. Investigators would later test the blood and determine that it was type O. Leigh's blood type was either type O or type A. Her parents weren't sure which, so this was potentially consistent with her blood type.
Okay.
I know that statement seems pretty vague in light of our capabilities today as far as forensic science goes, but bear in mind that in 1992, DNA analysis was in its infancy. It had only really begun being implemented in the late 1980s, and its use definitely wasn't prevalent in small towns like Tupelo, Mississippi. Forensic science has come so far in recent decades, it's amazing. I mean, in 1992, I was a small child living in a small southern coastal town, and I'm certain that DNA analysis wasn't being used in the investigation of crimes in that area at that time.
I was even smaller and had no clue what DNA was.
You know what? Neither did I. Okay, so anyway, now, just 30 years later, I work for a law enforcement agency that not only routinely uses DNA analysis in the course of investigations, but uses technology that could hardly have been dreamt of back in 1992. I'm talking about things like Faro laser scanners that visually preserve crime scenes in 3 dimensions. And if you're not familiar with that, look it up. I promise it's really fascinating.
I mean, just a side note here. You can order a kit from Ancestry or one of those other sources, and they can analyze your DNA through a mail order pretty much. So to think that law enforcement was just trying to figure out how to use this to tie cases together, and now it's something that anybody can go online and purchase a kit for, pretty cool.
It's come a long way. Anyway, the point is, in the realm of forensic science, technology has been advancing explosively over these past couple decades, which means that the technology available to most investigators in 1992 was vastly different and more limited than what's available to the average investigator today. Back to the initial evaluation of the crime scene. Alarmingly, officers found a nightgown, the very same nightgown Leigh had been wearing that morning when Vicky had left the house. It was in the laundry hamper in Leigh's room, and it was blood-stained. Tupelo Police Chief Aguirre stated that, quote, "Because it looked like the blood had dripped down onto her nightgown, you would think the injury had to be above the neck, possibly," end quote. This was, of course, consistent with the blood spatter on the doorframe, which suggested that someone around Leigh's height had suffered a head injury. How that injury happened, we don't know. Someone could have struck her over the head with some kind of object, or perhaps pushed her into the doorframe where blood spatter was found. We're just not sure. Police were understandably alarmed, concerned that Leigh may have been abducted. The blood pooled on the floor and spattered on the doorframe wasn't a huge amount, certainly not enough to suggest a fatal amount of blood loss. Still, officers feared for Leigh's life for obvious reasons. Nobody injures and abducts a child with positive intent. Now, although Leigh's nightgown had been left behind, Vicky noticed that some new clothes Leigh had gotten for her birthday were missing, along with a sleeping bag. A missing sleeping bag might sound odd, but I assumed that Leigh's attacker presumably placed her deceased or unconscious body inside of it and transported her out of and away from the home inside of the sleeping bag.
It definitely makes sense. It conceals the body and it's something that's on hand and presumably would fit her.
Right. In any case, when police began searching and canvassing the neighborhood, they were looking for Leigh in that missing outfit. In addition to officers' efforts, bloodhounds were brought in an effort to track Leigh's scent. Unfortunately, the canines weren't able to locate a scent trail. Their abilities could perhaps have been impeded by the stormy weather. Not only was it rainy, it was also incredibly windy. Despite their efforts, investigators found no trace of Leigh anywhere within the half-mile radius of her home that they initially searched. So naturally, they expanded their searches outside of residential areas, combing through the surrounding fields and forested land. More than 100 volunteer searchers worked alongside law enforcement, and according to an article by journalist William Moore, authorities and civilians alike were deeply concerned that Leigh might have been out there somewhere, injured and perhaps even purposely hidden. When the stormy weather cleared, authorities added helicopters to the search. But as the days slipped by in a blur of intense, frantic searching, police had less and less hope that Leigh would be found alive. Meanwhile, back at the home Leigh shared with her mom, crime scene investigators had discovered more than just the blood on the floor and the door frame near Leigh's room. They'd also found what they described as a pink haze on the countertops in the bathroom. According to the chief of police, it appeared as if someone had wiped the countertop, smearing blood over its surface and leaving that pale pink film. As for whatever towel, cloth, or other item they'd used to wipe the countertop, that was nowhere to be found. Something else that was nowhere to be found was any sign of forced entry. Whoever had harmed and presumably abducted Leigh hadn't had to break into the house to get to her. This could have meant that Leigh's abductor was someone she knew, of course, or it could have meant that at least one of the home's entry points had been left unsecured. Search efforts lasted for weeks, but it wasn't until 8 days after Leigh's disappearance that any potential sign of her arose. On that 8th day, a local college student reported to police that they'd seen a girl who looked like Leigh riding with a man in a pickup truck that had been going through a McDonald's drive-thru in the nearby town of Boonville, which was about a half-hour's drive from Tupelo. Investigators followed up on the tip, but the girl who'd been seen in the truck turned out to be another child who'd simply been out for some fast food. No foul play. A few days later, though, something happened. Something very strange and something that was definitely tied to Leigh. A package arrived in the mail at Leigh and Vicky's home, a package shipped from the nearby town of Boonville, where that false sighting had occurred at the McDonald's drive-thru. And the contents of that package shocked and alarmed investigators. More on that next. And now, back to Leigh's story. It wasn't clear who had sent the mysterious package to Leigh and Vicky's home. There was no return address. However, they could tell from the postmark that the package had been dropped in a mailbox in Boonville, and whoever had sent it had affixed more than enough stamps to it, as if they wanted to make absolutely sure that the package made it to its destination. As for the inside of the package, it contained a single object, Leigh's glasses. Now, she didn't wear glasses all the time. They were reading glasses, so she had to wear them sometimes, but they were definitely recognizable as hers. There was no letter accompanying the glasses, no note, nothing like that. As we mentioned earlier, forensic DNA analysis was still in its early days at this point, but even so, investigators hoped that they might recover some sort of evidence from the package. However, they found that the stamps had been affixed with water, not saliva, and disappointingly, no fingerprints had been left on the stamps either. Because of the lack of letter or note with the glasses, according to that Daily Journal article by William Moore, investigators felt that the package was intended to throw them off the trail, to distract them from the investigation and from the truth. On this note, it's important to note that that package, it was mailed after that McDonald's drive-thru sighting occurred, but probably before investigators realized that that sighting had been false, that it was just another girl who looked like Leigh. So whoever sent that package probably thought they were being pretty clever by playing off of that sighting and sending it from the town where that sighting had occurred, even though by the time it arrived, investigators knew that sighting hadn't been legitimate. So it's easy to see why investigators think that this was meant to throw them off the track, but at the same time, how did that person have Leigh's glasses? Another thing worth noting about the package was that it wasn't addressed to Vicky. Rather, it was addressed to Leigh's stepfather, Barney Yarborough.
Okay, why haven't we heard about him yet?
Well, up until this point, I haven't mentioned Barney because he wasn't living in the house with Leigh and Vicky. He and Vicky, to whom he was married, had actually separated a few weeks before Leigh's disappearance. So they weren't divorced yet. That would be made official a couple years later, but they had recently separated and Barney was no longer living in the house.
Okay, I'm sensing there's more to it than just that.
Well, up until a few weeks before the disappearance, he had been living in the house, so his moving out was a recent development. Now, why the package was addressed to Barney instead of Vicky, I don't know. If the package was intended as an unhelpful distraction, as police suspected, addressing it to Barney might possibly have been another layer of that distraction technique. Also, there was a misspelling in the address. They misspelled the word honey, which is a pretty easy word to spell. I mean, what are you, Winnie the Pooh? So to me, that makes me think that it probably was somebody playing dumb or trying to plot a distraction. I think that somebody who knows to avoid using their saliva or leaving their fingerprints on a postage stamp, I think that person probably knows how to spell the word honey. Anyway, speaking of Barney, he was one of the first people investigators looked at in regards to Leigh's disappearance and the possibility of foul play. And so was Vicky, Leigh's mom, and Leigh's biological father, Donald Occhi. Investigators looked into these three parents not because of anything in particular any of them had done, but rather because when a child is harmed or killed, a parent or guardian is, statistically speaking, most likely to be responsible. When it comes to Donald, Leigh's biological father, he was living well over 800 miles, or well over 1,200 kilometers, away in Virginia at the time of her disappearance. He was in the military and was stationed at a Virginia Army base. He stayed in touch with Leigh, but her mother, Vicky, had full custody of her.
So I'm assuming that would mean that it was easy to track and he had an alibi readily available.
Yeah, the military tends to keep records, so when Donald learned of his daughter's disappearance, at first he thought that Leigh must have run away for some reason. Racked with worry, he spent the following days in a daze, wondering what had happened and if she was safe. When 2 weeks passed by without her returning, he couldn't take it any longer. He left Virginia and traveled to Mississippi to join the search efforts. He took leave from the Army and spent weeks contributing to the search, desperately hoping and trying to find any trace of Leigh. As Donald searched, knowing that his only child, if she was still alive, might be out there injured somehow and somewhere, he couldn't help but think of something that had happened years ago when Leigh had only been a baby and had just learned to walk. Donald had been in the Army then, just as he still was at the time of her disappearance, and had fallen off of a cliff during a training exercise. He'd sustained a serious injury to his eye, and so, after managing to climb back up the cliff, had come home so that Vicky, who was still his wife at the time, could take him to the emergency room. While Vicky got ready to do so, Donald was lying on the couch with a big bandage medics had placed over his eye. And then Leigh emerged into the hallway, saw him, did this huge gasp, and charged toward him as best as she could on her little baby legs.
Adorable.
Yeah. When she got to him, she kissed him on the nose, and being such a young baby, it was the first time she'd ever kissed anyone.
That is very sweet.
Yeah, so she was very concerned about her dad and his injury. So it was precious memories like these that fueled Donald as he threw himself into the search, torn between hope and every parent's worst nightmare. Donald may have lived far away from Leigh, but he wasn't some deadbeat dad. He loved his daughter and had an assortment of treasured memories with her from babyhood and beyond. Speaking of which, according to crime writer David Lohr, who's written an excellent series of articles on this case, Leigh was little more than a baby when her parents divorced. It was tough, but as I mentioned earlier, Donald remained in touch with his daughter, and she would sometimes go to stay with him in distant Virginia. It's easy to understand why investigators have to look into the possibility of parents, including non-custodial parents, being involved whenever a child disappears. In fact, it's not uncommon for abducted children to be taken by their non-custodial parents. However, Donald had been in Virginia when Leigh had disappeared. Given that, the possibility of his involvement was quickly discounted. During the month that Donald spent in Mississippi searching for his daughter, he hired several psychics in an effort to find her. Donald wasn't someone who normally, or even necessarily at all, believed in the purported abilities of psychics, and he certainly wouldn't have consulted them under any other circumstance, but as he told media, quote, "Anybody who's had someone missing would do the same thing. You've got nothing to lose," end quote. So he followed up on every tip he received, both psychic and otherwise, to no avail. Of course, another father figure in Leigh's life, her stepfather, Barney, also had to be looked at. He and Vicky had separated, and he'd moved out of the family home just weeks before Leigh's disappearance. When I first read this, it gave me pause, and that's because, statistically speaking, whenever women leave abusive relationships, the most dangerous time period is the 12 months following the breakup. They're actually in more danger of being harmed or killed during that first post-split year than they were when they were still in the relationship. Now, to clarify, I'm not saying that Barney and Vicky's relationship was abusive. Frankly, I have no idea whether it was, and no evidence to suggest that it was. But if it was, and that's a big if, given that the breakup was fresh, Barney could potentially have been more likely than ever to lash out with violence. What if he directed that violence at Leigh rather than Vicky? After all, what more efficient way could there be to hurt a parent than to take their child from them?
That's a pretty sadistic thought, but it's absolutely correct.
Wouldn't be the first time something like that happened. In this vein, there were rumors circulating around Tupelo that Barney had been abusive toward Leigh, perhaps even physically striking her. Some people pointed out that there had been occasions when Leigh had shown up to school with bruises, even a black eye. Leigh hadn't attributed those injuries to Barney, but in the wake of her disappearance, people wondered and speculated. Had Barney inflicted those injuries upon Leigh? For the record, Barney did have an alibi, and he did help with the search efforts in the wake of Leigh's disappearance. In fact, he was noted by investigators to have always been cooperative with the investigation and always willing to assist with search efforts. Nevertheless, investigators asked him to submit to a polygraph examination, which he did. The results of that polygraph showed no signs of deception, but of course we know that polygraphs are not scientifically reliable. In any case, according to journalist William Moore, Barney was ruled out as a potential suspect early in the investigation. There was simply no evidence to suggest he'd been involved, no reason to question his alibi, and nothing to suggest that the speculation over possible abuse was anything more than unsubstantiated rumor in the wake of a likely murder. For the record, according to attorney and true crime writer Jen Baxter, attorneys also asked Leigh's father, Leigh Occhi, to undergo a polygraph examination. He did so, and his exam results also revealed no signs of deception. Speaking of polygraphs, investigators also asked Vicky to submit to one, and she did. Actually, she submitted to 3 separate polygraph exams on 3 separate occasions. one administered by local investigators and two administered by the FBI. And each time, the results indicated that she'd been deceptive. But remember, polygraphs are essentially junk science.
Being her advocate here, given what polygraphs monitor and measure and what her mental and emotional state would be in that situation, having lost her daughter, I think it would be pretty hard to get a clean reading anyways.
That's what Vicky said. She claims that her results were a result of her intense anxiety over the situation, and that's totally possible. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. I've been polygraphed as a precondition of employment, and I hated it. I'm an anxious person, and I was so worried that my body's vital signs might be interpreted as deception, even though I told the truth. It didn't happen to me. I passed the polygraph exam just fine, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't happen to others. Forget about the polygraph results, because investigators had other concerns about Vicky when it came to her viability as a potential suspect. For starters, she was the only person they knew of who'd had the opportunity to harm Leigh. She'd been alone in the house with her all night and early that morning. It certainly would have been possible for her to harm her daughter that morning, remove her from the home, and then feign surprise when supposedly coming home to check on her a short while later.
Also, the hurricane would have been a great reason for her to return home after being at work.
Yeah. Now, this brings us to Vicky's decision to come home and check on Leigh almost immediately after arriving at work. Had Vicky really been so anxious that she'd felt compelled to return home literally just minutes after leaving? I mean, maybe, but it seems a little odd. After all, a single missed phone call could be explained in any number of plausible ways. Maybe Leigh had been in the bathroom or getting dressed and simply hadn't gotten to the phone in time. It's easy to see how Vicky picking up everything and rushing to the house because of this may seem over the top.
So we mentioned how big of a deal it is for a kid to be able to stay home by themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And we've mentioned the hurricane with it, but it seems like one of those things that could be very easily pushed to a later date when the environment was safer. If you really are that concerned that you're going to rush back home right after you left, I can definitely see why they're suspicious of her.
Yeah, on the other hand, though, I mean, Leigh was only going to be home alone for an hour, and her mom had to go to work on time, basically. And Leigh's grandmother was planning to show up just an hour after she left, and Vicky probably didn't want to call her mom and potentially wake her up early and try to rush her when it was just 1 hour at home. It's not that long of a period of time. So
I can see both aspects.
Yeah, me too. Also, Vicky says that Leigh was afraid of thunderstorms. So afraid, in fact, that she'd spent the night before sleeping with Vicky in her bed, afraid to be alone in her own room. She did this even though Vicky snored loudly, which could make sleep difficult. They actually slept at opposite ends of the bed, with their head and feet at opposite ends because of that. So maybe Vicky felt bad about leaving her daughter home alone for the first time during stormy weather, which she knew she was afraid of. According to journalist William Moore, Vicky's aloof manner did little to persuade people that she hadn't been responsible for her daughter's disappearance. To many citizens of Tupelo, she seemed cold and reserved, not at all like how they imagined the mother of a missing and endangered child should be. According to Donald, townspeople would approach him and tell him that when it came to whoever had harmed his daughter, he needed to look no further than his ex-wife, Vicky. But of course, there's no universally right way to act in the face of such a tragedy. As for what Vicky's hypothetical motive for harming her own daughter could have been, there's only speculation. One speculative theory I've seen mentioned online is this. Leigh was a teenager, so perhaps she and her mother got into some sort of argument and Vicky lost her temper, perhaps pushing her and causing her to strike her head on a doorframe or other surface, resulting in a fatal head injury. In such a scenario, she might have tried to conceal what had happened. Leigh's father, Donald, has pointed out that Vicky was not only notably intelligent, but a military veteran, and that the military had trained her to conduct interrogations. So perhaps she had outsmarted investigators at their own game when they'd questioned her. However, It would be unfair to assume guilt based on Vicky's past career and training.
Yeah, veteran status doesn't make somebody guilty.
They specifically reference that interrogation training. I've seen that tossed around online a lot, and there are a lot of people who think that Vicky was responsible for Leigh's disappearance and presumed death, but I don't think that's fair. I mean, it makes me, I'm a professional crime analyst. What if I was, God forbid, drawn into some horrible situation like this and potentially a person of interest or suspect, and people were like, oh, she's a crime analyst, she must be some sort of criminal genius who beat investigators at their own game. And I'm not a criminal genius, and I don't think I can beat investigators at their own game, okay? The element of this case that casts the largest shadow of doubt over Vicky is perhaps this. What are the odds that someone else would have managed to enter the home, injure and abduct Leigh during the short period of time between when Vicky left the house for work and when she returned ostensibly to check on Leigh?
And also, how would they get in without forcing entry?
Yeah, we're talking about a 55-minute window of time between when Vicky left the house and when Leigh failed to answer her phone call. So less than an hour.
It's really rather quick for all of that. And to clean up blood.
Yeah. So what are the odds that someone would show up to the house during that time and attack and abduct Leigh? Probably not very high. After all, this was the first time Leigh had ever been left home alone in her entire life. It wasn't as if this was a regular occurrence that a stalker could have anticipated by observing her routines. As improbable as the scenario may seem, Vicky told police that she had an idea of who might have done exactly what I just described. His name was Oscar McKinley Kearns III, and he was a 35-year-old local man who attended the same church as Leigh and her mother. In fact, he was a Sunday school teacher there. He lived in Tupelo, approximately a mile away from Vicky and Leigh, and he enjoyed horseback riding.
And you also used all of his names.
Well, yeah, I did, so I guess you got a bit of a clue what's coming up. But now, this is notable because Leigh loved horses and took riding lessons at the same stable where Kearns rode. Initially, Vicky became suspicious of him because of some odd behavior on his part. For starters, after Leigh's disappearance, he stopped by her house, uninvited and unannounced, something he'd never done before, to give Vicky a photo of Leigh. Now, where he got that photo from, I don't know, but at first, Vicky assumed he was just another concerned citizen trying to help. I mean, remember, there were over 100 volunteers participating in the search. People were really upset over this. Over time, though, she noticed that he would avoid making eye contact with her, and she began to suspect that perhaps he was something more, something worse than just an awkward, well-meaning guy. Call it a mother's intuition, maybe. Over time, it came to light that Kearns was more than just a church-going horse enthusiast. As the months wore on, it turns out that there may have been something to Vicky's intuition after all. Less than 9 months after Leigh's disappearance in May of 1993, Kearns kidnapped a 15-year-old girl. And Kearns had met that girl through his church, the same church that Leigh had attended and where he'd taught Sunday school. According to journalist William Moore, Kearns abducted the girl and drove her away from home at approximately 7 a.m. under the pretense of taking her to school. However, he actually drove her to a remote area where he sexually assaulted her. Afterward, he did eventually drop her off at her school, and she contacted police immediately. The Mississippi Sex Offender Registry, Kearns pleaded guilty to rape, and while he did go to prison, he was released after less than 4 years.
For raping a minor?
Yeah, for abducting and raping a minor. Pretty sick, right? Now, less than 18 months after his release, big fat surprise, he abducted someone else. This time, he abducted a married couple and sexually assaulted the wife. Quick side note here. When I read about this particular crime, I assumed that the married couple were adults. However, when I checked the sex offender registry, I found that Kearns was convicted of abducting a minor victim and of raping a victim under the age of 14, and these offenses occurred at or approximately at the same time that he reportedly abducted that couple and sexually assaulted the wife, and there were no other proximal offenses. So to be honest, I'm confused. Was the married woman he abducted and sexually assaulted actually a girl 13 years old or younger? This seems incredibly unlikely, but I looked up Mississippi law and found that technically this could be legally possible under certain circumstances, unfortunately.
I'm pretty sure they have a pretty loose grasp of a Romeo and Juliet clause.
Maybe Kieran's abducted and assaulted a literal child bride. Or maybe there's some mistake in the reporting I've read and the victim wasn't actually a married woman or married girl. I'm not really sure. Maybe I've just got some element of this particular crime mixed up. But the point is, Kieran's was a sexual predator who we know abducted and sexually assaulted a teenage girl on at least one occasion. Furthermore, we know that he abducted a teenage girl from her home early in the morning before she left for school. This is incredibly similar to what may have happened to Leigh. What's more, he did this 9 months after Leigh went missing. By that time, Vicky already suspected him and had already voiced her suspicions to police. So it wasn't as if she could have copied his past MO so that she could blame her daughter's disappearance on a known child predator, a convenient scapegoat. It hadn't even happened yet. He wasn't even known to be a sexual predator at all when she first voiced her concerns. Naturally, investigators attempted to ask Cairns about Leigh's disappearance, but he remained tight-lipped. And then, in 2021, he died, and any chance of him ever telling the police the truth, if he was indeed involved, died along with him. So is it possible that he was responsible for Leigh's disappearance? Certainly.
There's definitely potential there.
Right, he's a known sexual predator who has committed multiple abductions, at least one of which was eerily similar in time and manner to Leigh's abduction. The big question, of course, is how Cairns would have known that Leigh was home alone for the first time that morning.
Well, I can throw this out there. Perhaps he didn't know she was home alone. Maybe he was going to meet with Vicky and see if he could take her to work at the horse stables or go horseback riding.
Well, I think that would be very unlikely in the hurricane weather, as a former horse girl myself.
I know it would be unlikely, but with summer coming to an end, or perhaps he was going to offer to give her a ride to the open house.
Here's my thoughts. One, maybe he was just watching and stalking her. He lives less than a mile away. Like, he was right there. And just watching a young girl's house kind of seems like something he might do. Like, he might have taken advantage of that. Another thing is it possible that he might have guessed based off of circumstances, or that Leigh might have told him that she was going to be home alone that morning? Remember, they knew each other. He was a Sunday school teacher at their church. He was in a trusted position with the children at their church. And they also knew each other from the stables, and Cairns had asked her to go riding with him on at least one occasion. Even if she hadn't mentioned it to him, remember, Vicky just had split up weeks ago with her husband. So probably anybody in their church would know about this and would know about the recent breakup. And for a child sexual predator like Cairns, that could be a freaking gold mine of an opportunity for him to watch the house and see if Leigh was left alone at all now that Barney had moved out.
It is.
It's possible that if Cairns had knocked on Leigh's door that morning, she might have opened it to speak with him. She probably considered him someone she could trust. However, although there's good reason to be suspicious of Cairns, there's no proof that he was responsible for Leigh's disappearance. In November of 1993, a little over a year after Leigh's disappearance, a farmer made a momentous discovery in his soybean field. There, he found a human skull. Naturally, investigators immediately suspected that it might be Leigh's and set about having it identified via dental records. It wasn't long before the remains were ID'd as being Leigh's, but, heart-wrenchingly for all involved, this turned out to be a mistake.
A mistake?
Yeah. Numerous teeth were missing from the skull at the time it was discovered. And this naturally made it challenging to ID via dental records. And after declaring the ID, investigators realized that they'd been mistaken. The skull wasn't Leigh's. Rather, it belonged to Pollyanna Sue Keith, a 27-year-old woman who'd gone missing in the spring of 1993. To this day, what exactly happened to Leigh remains unknown. It's likely that she's deceased, but the location of her remains is also unknown. The ongoing mystery remains a source of anguish for those who loved her. If you know anything about the disappearance of Leigh Occhi, please contact the Tupelo Police Department at 662-841-6491.
That's all for this episode of Last Seen Alive. We hope you've enjoyed listening. Make sure you check out our website, lastseenalivepodcast.com, for photos from the story and links to the sources we used to write it. While you're at it, follow us on Insta and Twitter at LSA Podcast. New episodes of Last Seen Alive go live every other Monday. See you then. If you don't want to wait until then to listen to more episodes, check out our Patreon, where we have full-length bonus episodes available for subscribers only. Also, if you've enjoyed what you heard here today, please take a moment to rate or review Last Seen Alive and tell your friends to check us out too. We'd really appreciate it. Last Seen Alive is written and researched by you, Leah. Audio engineering and editing is provided by Podcast Post Production. Check out Podcast Post Production at podcastpostproduction.com for all of your podcasting needs.